When Germany's war machines swept across Europe in 1940, British destroyers and cruisers still patrolled the seas with the authority of an empire that had dominated naval warfare for centuries. German commanders respected those ships, certainly, but they feared something else far more. The small, silent, unpredictable groups of men who came in the dark, struck without warning, and vanished before alarms were fully raised. These were Britain's early Royal Navy Commandos, the raiding arm of combined operations, born not from tradition but from desperation. Their presence signaled something destroyers never could: a threat that bypassed coastal guns, radar stations, patrol boats, and fortified harbors entirely. The idea emerged as Britain faced the bleak summer of 1940. France had fallen. The Wehrmacht controlled the coastline from the Bay of Biscay to Norway. The Kriegsmarine believed that, with Europe in German hands, Britain had been pushed back to its island cage. But Churchill understood something his enemy did not: Britain could strike even without an army on the continent. In June 1940, he issued a simple order: set Europe ablaze. From that moment, small teams of naval-trained raiders were tasked with doing what destroyers and cruisers could not: landing on enemy shores, attacking infrastructure, gathering intelligence, and reminding German coastal garrisons that no outpost was truly safe. Their operations were deliberately unpredictable. One night they targeted a radar station in Brittany, another night a fish oil plant in Norway that supplied the German war industry, and on another they quietly slipped into a harbor and took prisoners straight from their barracks. These raids were more than tactical actions, they were psychological weapons. The Kriegsmarine's coastal commanders complained that destroyers could be tracked, submarines could be monitored, but British commandos arrived like ghosts. Reports circulated that no minefield, no patrol, no cliff face could stop them. And for the German soldier standing guard on a lonely fjord or a windswept island, the fear was not of a British fleet on the horizon, but of footsteps in the dark. The transformation of ordinary sailors into elite raiders was rapid and ruthless. Training combined naval seamanship with assault tactics, demolition, winter warfare, and silent infiltration. Unlike destroyer crews, who operated with full logistical support, commandos carried everything on their backs. They navigated fjords at night in small boats, climbed cliffs under fire, and attacked fortified positions using only speed, surprise, and precise coordination. Their raids were not massive battles. They were controlled bursts of violence designed to produce maximum disruption with minimal manpower. Yet the true reason Germans feared them more than ships was simple. Destroyers damaged infrastructure, but commandos assaulted confidence. Their operations undermined German claims of total control. Every successful raid forced Berlin to reinforce hundreds of miles of coastline, stretching manpower thin and leaving commanders anxious about where the next strike would fall. The psychological strain these raids created became clear in the winter of 1940–41, when the German command rushed to fortify every isolated outpost along the Atlantic and Norwegian coasts. Reports flowed into Berlin describing a threat that was never seen until it struck and was never caught once it withdrew. In some regions, entire battalions were reassigned simply to guard small harbors or remote power stations. What unsettled German officers was not the scale of the attacks, but the pattern. The British were not choosing symbolic targets, but operational ones. They were probing radar stations, fuel depots, coastal artillery positions, and communication hubs, places essential to the German war machine. The raid on the Lofoten Islands in March 1941 marked a turning point. It was not just a demonstration of reach, but of precision. Before dawn, Royal Navy commandos landed on multiple points across Vestfjorden, destroying fish oil factories that produced glycerin, the base ingredient for German explosives, while gathering valuable Enigma-related documents from German vessels in the harbor. The speed of the operation stunned local garrisons. By the time reinforcements arrived, the commandos were already disappearing into the mist aboard fast-moving Royal Navy ships. No destroyer alone could have delivered such a measured blow. The targets were inland, dispersed, and required the human element that could infiltrate, destroy, and withdraw within hours. The impact on German morale was immediate. Intercepts recorded days later revealed alarm among Kriegsmarine officers, who described the attackers as highly trained, fearless, and impossible to anticipate. One commander warned that any quiet coastal village could become a staging area for the next raid. The idea that British forces could strike at any point along hundreds of miles of shoreline forced the Germans into a defensive posture that consumed considerable manpower, an outcome Britain desperately needed at that stage of the war. What further increased German fear was the evolution of commando tactics. By late 1941, Britain had refined the art of combined operations. The commandos no longer acted as scattered raiders. They operated alongside naval gunfire, intelligence units, and sometimes RAF support. Each raid became a carefully orchestrated sequence, using intelligence gathered from Norwegian resistance cells, air reconnaissance, and submarine patrols. This rising sophistication led to one of the most remarkable operations of the early war, the Vaagso raid in December 1941, which demonstrated that commandos were not merely saboteurs. They were capable of overwhelming fully defended towns. The Germans quickly realized that these raids were strategic signals. Britain was preparing something larger, and every successful commando assault carried the same message. No garrison, however remote or fortified, could claim safety. The Vaagso raid, launched on December 27, 1941, crystallized German fears in a way few naval actions ever had. Destroyers could shell a coastline, but they could not distinguish between military positions and civilian structures, nor could they dismantle an industrial town with the speed and precision that commandos achieved that morning. As British ships opened fire to pin down German defenses, the commandos stormed ashore under cover of smoke, moving with a discipline that belied their small numbers. Within minutes, they had seized German headquarters, destroyed fish oil plants crucial to the war economy, and engaged Wehrmacht units in close quarter fighting through the streets. The intensity of the combat shocked the German garrison. They were accustomed to tracking enemy vessels, not defending against an amphibious assault executed with surgical coordination. By the time the commandos withdrew, they had dismantled the area's industrial capacity, inflicted heavy casualties, captured intelligence, and forced the Germans to commit thousands of soldiers to reinforce Norway's coastline. It was a raid that carried an impact far beyond its geographical scale. It demonstrated a level of British reach and operational flexibility that destroyers alone could not replicate. The damage was not measured merely in structures destroyed, but in the shift of German defensive strategy. After Vaagso, Berlin reassessed the vulnerability of Norway, recognizing that its long coastline and isolated settlements offered countless opportunities for British raids. The Kriegsmarine issued new orders. All coastal garrisons, regardless of size, were to assume that raids could occur without warning. Patrols doubled. Sentries were tightened. Mines were laid in increasing density. The German command understood that if they failed to respond, Britain could choke off Norway's contribution to the German economy, particularly its vital ore shipments. At the same time, British commando units were undergoing further refinement. Training expanded to include winter warfare, cliff assaults, amphibious coordination, and sabotage techniques adapted from the Special Operations Executive. The men were no longer simply raiders. They were evolving into a hybrid force that blended naval infiltration with infantry capabilities. Their presence forced German commanders to divert not only manpower but also artillery, engineering units, and naval assets to coastal defense. Destroyers never triggered such sweeping strategic reactions. By early 1942, German intelligence documents acknowledged a new reality. The British were using these raids to test defenses, gather reconnaissance, and psychologically destabilize garrisons along the Atlantic Wall. Commanders warned that the raids were preparation for a larger invasion, a conclusion that tied up German resources in anticipation of a threat that could come anywhere, at any time. And Britain, sensing the mounting anxiety, prepared to escalate the scale of its operations even further. The escalation came in March 1942 with one of the most audacious naval commando operations of the entire war, the Nazaire Raid. Unlike earlier strikes, this one was not about sabotage or psychological disruption alone. It was designed to eliminate a strategic asset, the Normandy dock, the only facility on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing Germany's largest battleship, the Tirpitz. No destroyer, no cruiser, not even a full naval task force could neutralize that drydock without entering a heavily defended harbor. Commandos, however, could deliver a blow that conventional naval forces simply could not attempt. Shortly after midnight on March 28, As German searchlights swept the estuary, the British destroyer HMS Campbellton, packed with timed explosives, rammed the dock gates under heavy fire. Moments later, the Commandos stormed the quays, fighting street to street as they placed demolition charges on pump houses, winding gear, and power stations. The complexity of the operation, penetrating one of France's best-defended ports, revealed a depth of planning that stunned German intelligence analysts afterward. Even after the Commandos withdrew, the Campbellton remained lodged in the dock until its hidden explosives detonated hours later, wrecking the massive gates and rendering the dry dock unusable for the rest of the war. For the Germans, this was more than an embarrassment. It forced a strategic recalculation. Without Street Nazaire, the Tirpitz could no longer operate freely in the Atlantic. An entire battle plan built around threatening Allied convoys collapsed in a single night. None of this had been accomplished by a fleet battle. It had been achieved by a few hundred men who had entered a fortified harbor, executed precise demolitions under fire, and exfiltrated against overwhelming odds. German naval officers admitted privately that the commando threat had now surpassed that of surface warships. A destroyer could announce its presence. Commandos imposed uncertainty. Saint Nazaire triggered widespread overreaction in German defenses. Coastal garrisons were reinforced across Brittany and Normandy. Construction teams were pulled from inland projects to expand fortifications along harbors. Anti-boat obstacles multiplied. Patrol craft were reassigned to waters that had seen no action, simply because commanders no longer trusted that any stretch of coastline was secure. The psychological impact reached even the Kriegsmarine's upper ranks. New directives insisted that harbors are not safe zones, a remarkable admission from a navy that had once regarded port facilities as invulnerable. But while Street Nazaire became the raid that dominated headlines, it was not the only operation shaping German perceptions. Britain was simultaneously preparing for a far larger test, one intended not only to gather intelligence but to probe German coastal defenses on a massive scale. That larger test arrived in August 1942 at Dieppe, a raid that dwarfed every preceding operation in both scale and ambition. Although the primary assault force consisted of Canadian infantry supported by armor, naval gunfire, and air power, the role of British naval commandos remained central. They operated as reconnaissance guides, beach-breaching teams, and demolition specialists. Dieppe was not a victory. Its heavy casualties are well known, but for the Germans, the most unsettling lesson was what the raid implied. Britain was willing to use commando-trained units as the cutting edge of future amphibious operations, even against fortified towns bristling with coastal guns. German commanders recognized this immediately. Reports described the presence of small, highly trained landing elements who targeted artillery positions, communication centers, and clifftop defenses. Unlike conventional infantry, these teams moved with the precision already witnessed in Norway and France. They were not there to seize ground, they were there to dismantle key assets. Even though the raid ultimately faltered, the Germans could not ignore the warning Dieppe delivered. The British were perfecting a method of breaking into the Atlantic Wall using fast, specialized raiders who could disable coastal defenses long before a full invasion force arrived. This fear was reinforced by the nature of the damage caused. At several beaches, commando teams reached their inland targets despite fierce opposition. German officers noted that if similar units preceded a larger invasion, they could blind coastal batteries, sabotage radar stations, and cripple port infrastructure before the main force even landed. Destroyers could never achieve such precision. A naval bombardment could disrupt defenses, but it could not climb cliffs, cut communications lines, or eliminate machine gun nests hidden in concrete casemates. Commandos could, and repeatedly had. In response, German defensive planning shifted again. Hitler ordered the strengthening of every potential landing site in France and the Low Countries. The pace of Atlantic Wall construction accelerated. More artillery and infantry units were pulled from the Eastern Front for coastal defense. Mines and anti-landing obstacles were laid in unprecedented quantities, and new directives emphasized rapid response to small-scale incursions. The Germans were not simply preparing for destroyers. They were preparing for the men who moved in silence before the ships arrived. By late 1942, German assessments made a clear distinction between threats. Destroyers were predictable naval opponents. British commandos represented something far more dangerous. A force capable of infiltrating fortified zones, applying force precisely where it hurt most, and vanishing before the counterattack could form. Their actions suggested a coming storm, one that would eventually crash onto the shores of France with far greater strength. In the end, the fear Germany held for Britain's Royal Navy commandos was never about numbers or firepower. It was about uncertainty. Destroyers could be tracked, measured, and countered. Commandos could not. They operated in the shadows, choosing the time and place of every strike, forcing a continental power to defend thousands of miles of coastline against just a few hundred men. Their raids did not win the war on their own, but they reshaped the enemy's mindset, stretching defenses, draining resources, and exposing weaknesses long before the Great Invasion of 1944. They were a reminder that even in the darkest years of the conflict, Britain could still dictate the terms of battle. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more expertly researched wartime histories, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments which operation, weapon, or unit you'd like to explore next.